Hello and welcome to GPU-driven effects of The Last of Us Part 2. My name is Artem Kovalovs. I'm a programmer for Naughty Dog. In this talk, we're going to cover what we did when we were creating our GPU particle systems. It's a new system created for this game. We're going to talk about how we set them up, screen interaction, screen attachment, drip simulation, and so on. Warning: there's going to be blood and gore content in this presentation because of the content of our game. So GPU-driven particles are not is nothing anything new. We're inspired by work by Whitley and or other games who have been using GPU-driven particles. Particles in general are perfect for using GPU parallelism and offloading some work from CPU to GPU, which was our original goal. We also wanted to use GPU information for spawning particles such as depth buffer. However, what we achieved were, we realized that screen space can actually be used for all kinds of different effects, and there's so much information that could be beneficial for creating the effects. And so we created this liquid drip simulation we use for blood and water ribbons. We, developed attachment to objects that was pretty cheap, and that pushed the realism of the game much further because we had these new effects to play with. So as far as the setup of the particle system, nothing crazy here. We have buffers with attached GDS atomic counters that we can add to, append to. We can, as far as the setup goes, yeah, I have like a little list here. Is almost like command line interface. We have UI built on top where you can run different passes and you can specify dispatch and direct parameters, whether or not it's a counter size or maybe it's a fixed size. You can also execute draw calls for the particles if you wish to. Not every particle does so. Here's a little example of, we have an update job that will take an existing buffer, and for each one of those particles, the dispatch and direct, we update. Some particles will survive, some not, and we add it to the list. And then we're gonna add new particles in a different pass to spawn new pass, and then we're gonna draw them, do draw and direct. And then next frame we're just gonna flip. So we just ping pong between two different buffers. Here's the example of it in the game. This is a great example for this kind of system as rain splashes. So we analyze the depth buffer, we sample all over the place. We spawn a couple of wavefronts to sample the depth buffer. Look at other G buffer parameters and everything. If everything goes well, we spawn rain splashes. And note, this will be very hard to do with just CPU or like a traditional emitter placement. Um, Method. It would just be too much placement. It would not follow the geometry properly. In addition, it also spawns on characters. So it would be, with the CPU and the particles and offsets from the joints. It's not flexible. This approach is much better and doesn't require any work from the FX artist. Works on characters. It also is very cheap in the sense that we only spawn things that are in the view frustum, right? So we only spawn things in the screen space. So also is very cheap. So no requirement for placement. Works well, works fast, and is a great example of what we want to use GPU particles for. As far as communications between systems, what if we want to make a little bit more complex behaviors? Well, we do have ability to create kind of these global buffers that the particles can add to and can read from. So for example, we have these building on top of the rain splashes, we have these drip collision systems that is just phantom particles falling, and if they generate collision with the depth buffer, they potentially add a hint to this global buffer, this G splash hint buffer. So we have multiple systems feeding into that buffer, and then as far as the rain splashes are concerned, they will read that buffer when they're spawning new particles. So they will use those hints to spawn new particles. Here's an example of this where Abby is moving towards a water stream, and there's phantom particles are colliding with her, and the hints are added for rain splashes to be spawned. So in addition to spawning rain splashes from the rain, we also spawn rain splashes from these collisions, which is great. You might have also noticed that she was actually flinching when she was under that water stream, and the rain splashes were falling. And that's because we have this queue for sending the events from GPU to CPU, where we can generate events. So read them on the CPU on GPU, read them on the CPU, and then we send them to scripts or whatever. And then in this particular case, there was a script that's running and catching those events and making her play that gesture. We use that queue also for spawning particles and spawning sounds. Very, very useful to be able to send information in terms of events from GPU to CPU. But of course, we also, need more complex behaviors. For explosions or sticky snow or insects or droplets, anything like that. We need to actually have more persistent attachment rather than a splash, just like that happens in the world. Even rain splashes should fall a little. They look a little weird when they just stay and still. It's nice when they actually follow the character a little bit when they spawn on the character. So what we want to do is we want to generate collisions uh, with the world and have particles actually stay. In this particular case, you can see how these particles will collide with the ground and stay there. Hundreds of collisions potentially happening per frame. And again, perfect example for GPU particles where uh, we can just collide them and they die pretty quickly and everything is great. Here's another example of a little bit more complex behavior where we have a bunch of roaches sticking on the surface, I guess, and running around and scattering from light source, from the flashlight. And it's pretty cool because they can use a depth buffer information and G buffer normals to kind of follow. It kind of looks like they're hiding behind geometry or following the normal kind of deformation a little bit, which makes them look really cool. But again, really nice effect. Our FX artist Ray Popka did this one, and um, it's really cool that it's cheap, right? It's all just done GPU, and they run on on the CPU. It would be very hard to implement such a behavior because you can do it on a plane, but where there's a bunch of geometry, it would be much harder. But what if we want to have a little bit more complex attachment? What if we want to attach to actual moving, deforming geometry, such as character? So here's an example of our snow, right? So we wanted to achieve this kind of an effect where you can actually attach to moving, deforming character, right? So in this case, you can see snowflakes are realistically falling and actually sticking on the character and doesn't look like they're swimming. They're actually seem like they're sticking pretty well. So what's going on here? So whenever the particle lands, right, we need to frame to frame to frame actually update it, right? So the problem is we don't really have a mapping from the previous frame to the next frame. There's no such information. It doesn't exist, right? So we don't have that information. So knowing previous frames position of the particle doesn't give us information of the future frame. However, what is the information we do have? Well, we do have this idea of motion vector buffer, right? That comes from TAA, that we already have that buffer. Unfortunately, it doesn't point forward, it points backwards, right? For every pixel, we know where the pixel was last frame, more or less in 2D space, or in screen space. So what we can do though is whenever a particle lands, or in general, whenever a particle is attached, what we can do is we can look at that motion vector and predict where the particle is going to be next frame. So the motion vector kind of gives us the prediction of how the surface is moving, underlying surface is moving, that the particle sits on. Of course, that's not going to handle acceleration or deceleration, so we need to handle that particular case too. So what we're going to do is we are going to predict, we're going to calculate our previous position, current position, we divide it by our delta time, and that's going to gives us the predicted velocity. Um, However, when we land on the next frame, we have to do some correction, right? So in this particular case, I have this particle here. It was predicted to, based on the previous motion vector, to move with the geometry. You see the geometry move from here to here. Particle mispredicted and landed a little bit, it moved less than it should be moving, right? But what we can do then is we can look at, okay, this new pixel we landed on, where was that last frame? And now we can actually generate a delta, an error delta. We could just take this error delta and apply it to our particle. That's actually something we were doing before. But a more stable approach actually ended up being by just looking, okay, the new pixel we landed on, what is your motion from the previous frame, right? That motion that kind of gives us how much is the surface movement we landed on. We just hope we landed on the same surface. And then we say, all right, that's how much you move. Well, we're going to apply the same motion from our original previous position of the particle. And that lands us kind of to the, instead of the predicted position to the new position, kind of, but using the predicted position for retrieving the motion of the surface in the first place. That works surprisingly well. It's cheap, it works, yeah, surprisingly well, and can interact with things that we couldn't really interact with before. For example, blades of grass. Right, here's an example of, blades of grass are just cutouts. They're alpha cutouts of quads, right? So even if we collide with quads, we need to have alpha tests and so on. And this is really cheap approach. We just collide with a depth buffer and just follow the surface. And that those are the great pros. The cons, of course, are that the tracking is inconsistent. Sometimes you have particles falling through because the geometry disappears, geometry moves, you mispredict, you land on something completely different. You really have no options but to just kill the particles or just fall. But it works really well for things like snow, for example. We don't need perfect tracking for all the snow. Yet with this cheap approach, we have the illusion of the snow falling on the blades of grass, and it makes it more realistic. Moving on to particle ribbons, that's something we wanted to implement, was not just these individual particles, but actually a collection of particles, a sequence of particles that generates a ribbon. For example, water drips on the surface of this car here that we see how they are moving down with gravity. You see these like water drips happening, right? In fact, they also spawn little droplets whenever they hit curvature. So how do we do that? Well, ribbons is a little bit more complicated because they're not individual particles. So we need to track sequence. That sequence has to be particular order. We need to track connectivity. What happens if one particle inside of that sequence disappears? What happens then? Like if it loses tracking, right? What happens? What if a particle, for example, what if the ribbon becomes too big? So what do we do for this, for first of all, the sorting part of it? Well, the ribbon just lives in the wavefront, right? We have 64 threads in the wavefront. If the ribbon becomes too big, we just copy chunks of it into kind of a static wavefront where the ribbon doesn't advance, it just lives there and then dies off and so on. But what happens is, we have our particles, they live and they die depending on age. However, if the particle lose tracking, we still keep them in the wavefront, we just keep them dead. That allows us, when we're rendering, actually instead of connecting existing particles, we actually separate them and we render two ribbons instead of one connected ribbon, because when particles disappear, we cannot just blindly connect existing particles, because now you would have connections across larger areas. Doesn't look good at all. But yeah, but they just live in one wavefront, and we just compress them as they live and as they die, and we spawn new ones, and the new ones are the ones that look like they're advancing forward. Here's like a little screenshot of just bunch of generated geometry, just a bunch of quads connected to each other. Yet we use them as a gbuffer decal to modify the roughness, to modify the normals, specular normals we use for wetness, and that gives us illusion of water drips on the surface. Really good. So the question then becomes persist or not persist. The what we talked about so far is this idea of the particles that are tracking screen space. So obviously they're going to disappear as soon as you look away from them, or they will lose tracking. So what happens next? Do we need the persistence? Well, we of course do need persistence in some cases because we require it. For example, blood drips. But there's different kinds of persistence. For blood, we have this idea of render targets, right? We have the idea of blood render target. That is something that character applies to itself whenever character is rendered. As soon as you render to render target, you're good, right? It's gonna be fixed. It's there. It's in the render target. You don't care if it's tracked on screen space or not, right? So the problem is, okay, we can spawn particles on surface. The question is, okay, if you're in a character, how do you transfer from the world space position for this particle just lives on the surface into the UV space? What can we do to get that? But that's the trick, right? What we can do is we can use this idea of object ID buffer. That is something we already have in the engine, and I believe with the new compute shader architectures, we need to move more and more things into separate passes, and it's very likely the an engine should have some sort of an object ID buffer anyway, um, just to be able to do the effects later on, to do some sort of passes, compute passes on the geometry later on by just reconstructing the geometry. So in our case, the object ID buffer stores things like ID of the mesh and also some sort of way to reconstruct the primitive of the triangle, either it's vertices or a triangle ID. Either way, from a pixel point of view, we can reconstruct the triangle, and we also know what mesh it's on, the ID of the mesh that it's on. So the algorithm could be very simply then now whenever particle is on the pixel, we can sample the object ID, reconstruct a triangle, calculate the barycentric coordinates, look up the mesh. Does that we generate the mesh mappings on the CPU? We put it into the GPU, right? Is this mesh a character? Does it have a render target? What is the render target ID, right? The index. If all of that matches, we can calculate the barycentric on a triangle. We can calculate the UV coordinate from interpolating the texture coordinates for those particular verts, and we just send an event to the CPU saying, hey, spawn this blood particle into this UV space. Here's an example of it happening on the clicker. Here we shoot. You will see that as the character was standing up, the blood was dripping down. Now it's dripping sideways because of the gravity, and the character is now laying on the ground. Very interestingly, you will notice here that the blood actually traveled from one mesh to the other mesh. The pants are actually a different mesh. And the really good benefit from doing things in screen space is that you don't care about meshes. It's not like you're unwrapping meshes into separate textures or anything like that. You are just following screen space. So you can jump from mesh to mesh, and you can cross UV seams. All those two are great benefits from this particular system. In fact, you can see that we use screen space for simulation purposes. We can play this a little bit further. Um, we use screen space for purely simulation purposes. We then feed the particles into the render targets, right? And we have different behaviors. You will notice there's different behaviors on the skin versus on the cloth, on the clicker versus on the human, and we get all that information from screen space, which is great. And again, we can I mentioned here, we can cross the UV scenes, which can jump from mesh to mesh. We can even generate blood droplets that will collide with your own mesh or other meshes, and have more of a blood splatter on you. Here's an example of melee attack on a human here. The video pauses wherever we have cuts happening. So you will notice the cuts start out as pristine cuts, and then over time the blood starts dripping. And by the end of this sequence, the character is covered in blood, and it adds so much realism to this whole situation. Here's this video again in just real time. So cut after cut after cut, you notice with time the blood starts dripping more and more and more. In fact, if I can pause a little bit right here, you will notice that you will notice the dynamic nature of this. You can see, for example, if you look at the blood right here, you see how the blood starts out thick and then it thins out into kind of converges into smaller drips. On the cloth, on the face, it doesn't do that, and actually it follows different behaviors. But you will notice from frame to frame, the blood is actually dripping down because we're using screen space information to follow, for the blood to follow through. So again, yeah, pretty cool dynamic system. And again, very cheap, all screen space, right? So as far as actually spawning those ribbons, what happens when we want to spawn those ribbons? How do we spawn the ribbons? Because we cannot just where in the world space do we spawn them, right? All these particles live in the world space and then convert into UV space. Well, we know on the melee moves, the blood is generated by cuts, right? So those cuts are baked, right? So whenever a melee move happens, the particular blood texture is written into the render target. So what we do is we spawn these boxes. We spawn the spawner boxes, where we will start sampling randomly inside of the box. But because we do have this conversion from screen space to UV space, we can say, okay, I landed on a character. What is your UV? What does your render target say? Are you bloody? If the pixel is bloody, that's where we spawn those ribbons. So that way we randomly spawn. We randomly try to spawn everywhere. As soon as we land on the blood, we start spawning the drips. So you see the blood only spawning from those locations where the cuts actually happened. Really good. We also handle, these boxes are kind of independent spawners, and we just kind of in that ledger system that we have, the drip system just kind of keeps track like in a handle-like manner which spawners spawned when, so we don't spawn every frame. We actually tracks, the spawn rate and things like that. Here's an example of Abby. Here, character Abby, she's hurt, and you can see how she's actually starting to bleed from kind of her wounds on her arm. And as she's crawling like on the ground, it's following the gravity, and then as she stands up, it will follow gravity again, just in a different direction. Here in a second shot, I believe she stands up, and it gives another kind of cool, just cool level of realism to the whole situation. You will see how her blood is now going sideways a little bit now on her arm. So other persistent, right? If you don't have the render targets, what can we do? Well, because we have object ID, well, we can reconstruct it based on the triangle position, right? So we can just store the triangle, we can store the ascending coordinate, and from that we can reconstruct every frame. So in this case, here you go. We use it for water drips. Those water drips that we saw on the car, now we see them on the character, and they actually use that persistent attachment of storing the triangle information. And you see them, again, adding this little detail to the character, and you will also notice how many nice little droplets we generate from all those streams kind of going down her arm and then kind of hitting the curvature and not being able to advance forward, which is a really nice. Here's a debug view of the same situation, just to kind of to see much more clearly what is actually going on. You see a bunch of those drips, in fact, on her and on her body AI. You can see we're spawning the droplets, and you see how much simulation there's going on and how realistic it actually looks. And it's all in screen space. We're paying very little cost to do any of this. And again, with screen space information, we have so much more information already available. It's really nice to do this. It's really cheap. And here's like another example. Oop. Here is another example, just to make it clear that it is following the gravity. You see, like as you're changing the orientation, all these drips are following the gravity as you would expect. No character unwrapping, nothing like that. No, nothing, no crazy liquid simulation logic. The issue with that particular approach, what happens because we are kind of relying on the log change, sorry, we're relying on the mesh information. Well, yeah, if the log changes, you might have a problem where you miss from log to log, from frame to frame, the log changes. You suddenly don't have a mesh you were relying on to reconstruct your position. What we can do then is we can just fall back on the screen space tracking for one frame to then grab the new mesh information from the new log and go from there. We could also just do reskin if we wanted to. We can just do reskinning, but the mesh tracking itself worked for us pretty fine. Um, the only downside to all of this, of course, is the idea of we needing the object ID. In our case, we already had it, so for characters, it's fine. We don't do object ID, for example, for background. So for those particles falling on the leaves, we couldn't use that unless we actually started rendering object ID for the grass and things like that, which we could all do also. Here's like another example of this is the snow version that actually attaches persistently to the character. And you will notice as the camera flies around and goes back and forth, the particles are already there. And a nice, neat effect. Really cool. I really like this case here where she can run here in this particular area and under snow, and then you have characters attacking you. And if you look closely as you're fighting the characters, the snow also lands on them. It's subtle, but when you notice it, it's actually really cool to see the kid snow landing on the character as you're fighting them. It's pretty neat. Um, as far as interactions, what kind of other interactions can we do for this particular system? Well, here's one example, right? Because we know the information um, from the textures as far as like your blood, we can sample that, right? And we can sample that from the system that does the drips, right? So the drips, you will notice these water drips that are happening on the character, they look clear and fine on her arms, but as soon as they land on the bloody area, they tint red, right? So these water drips check the surface they're on. They check if the surface is bloody basically on the character, and if so, they tint themselves red, which is again really nice addition to realism, where they will be clear and then become reddish whenever they hit bloody area, which is really interesting. And once you notice it, it's like really cool, realistic detail. It just adds that much to the character. Yeah, and what are they? They're just sequences of quads that live on the character. They modify the G buffer and then ultimately result in this kind of look. Um, as the ribbon grows, it can retrieve the mesh data. From that, it can retrieve the UV coordinates and check the texture, and we're good to go. As far as performance go, again, we're using screen space. How, there's, depending on the particles, it can be more or less complex, but again, there's no looping, there's nothing like that. You just sample your depth buffers, your stencil buffers, your G buffers, you compress the G buffer. Overall, like in the case of these drips, up to 16,000 particles, the update was, I think it was a little less than 0.04 milliseconds, and it becomes insignificant on that particular scale whenever you put into async compute. And major savings compared to any kind of pre-processing of a character or unwrapping the UV space to generate the world positions to advance the simulation of water drips. So the cost of rendering is actually higher than the cost of update. And of course, it's extremely important to utilize async compute for a system like that, because it's just async compute is great for filling in the kind of the imperfections of a graphics pipes whenever geometry passes. So it's really nice to generate the compute shaders to fill in those gaps. So it becomes it's not free, but it becomes cheaper than if you just did it serially, of course. So conclusion, we knew we had to utilize the GPU to offload some of the work from CPU to GPU. We did that. That was the simple part, right? But we also realized that we had no clue, and we realized as we were developing that if you start utilizing the screen space, you have so much more. You have so much potential for all these kind of different effects. You can have insects sitting on the grass. As you crawl through the grass, they will fly off the blades of grass, and like it's mind blowing. Yet it's very cheap to implement. Or these water drips that pick up the blood tint as they cross the bloody area. we even had the cases where we had the water drips actually clear out the blood from the render target, because again, we know we're on screen space. The water runs across the bloody area. We just spawn a particle that instead of writing red, or writing 1 into render target for red, for blood, it writes 0 and clears out the blood, right? So all kinds of interesting things that are possible with this technique, and I hope that other people can implement this. Dynamic drips, extra realisms, falling on the surface, extra detail. Again, all of this just adds this additional level of high fidelity and detail to the game. Naughty Dog is hiring. We're always accepting applicants for interviews, so feel free to try to join us, and make sure you also check out other SIGGRAPH talks from Naughty Dog. I have another one about volumetrics, and Hawar and Pari and Wayland and Steven, they have other very interesting talks. Again, thank you very much for the Naughty Dog team. To the Naughty Dog team for ability to research all of this and work on this game. Thank you very much. Bye bye.